Answer me. Stand and unfold yourself.
Long live the king!
Bernardo,
He!
you come most carefully upon your hour.
'Tis now struck 12. Get thee to bed, Francisco.
For this relief, much thanks. 'Tis bitter cold, and I am sick at heart.
No, we got it. Good evening, dear friends. It's always good to see who shows up. I'll start with a verse. It's a poem by William Blake, The Introduction to Songs of Experience. You probably know it. Let's see, let me do a screen share. I'll read part of the verse, and then I will explain why I chose it. There's a method to my madness, as you will see. Okay, here's the verse. I'll read only half. Hear the voice of the bard, who present, past, and future sees, whose ears have heard the holy word that walked among the ancient trees, calling the lapsed soul, and weeping in the evening dew, that might control the starry pole, and fallen light renew. So, tonight, Fred Dennehy and I will split the evening. Fred will provide a Shakespearean actor's insider view of Shakespeare, and I will provide a spectator view from the gallery. But we will go in reverse order, from periphery to center. I'll begin first with a few introductory words about our theme, and then I'll briefly survey what Rudolf Steiner said about Shakespeare. There will be time for conversation at the end. And I should add that tonight's meeting builds on the introductory talk on the English language that Clifford Venho gave last week. I do recommend it to you, and you can find a video of the talk on the website. And there you can also find, on the website, one of Cliff's essays on Shakespeare. And I recommend that essay to you as well. Fred and I are hoping, by the way, that by doing this evening, we start to lay the groundwork for a conference on Shakespeare sponsored by this section, and we'll see if that is possible in the fullness of time. Okay, to begin, here is a picture of the cover of a book that we used in the past meetings with Jane and Terry Hippolito when our section last studied Shakespeare several years ago. It is a book published by Yale University Press that surveys various art historical attempts to recover an image of the person William Shakespeare. One might argue that persons in our time feel a need to search for Shakespeare, whereas for the first century or so after his death, Shakespeare was not lost, nor did anyone have the notion that they needed to search for him. But we live in a different time, and it's a time of celebrity and notoriety and personality, and the celebration of personality. And so the fact that Shakespeare, as Rudolf Steiner expressed it, withdraws behind his characters, well, this annoys and frustrates many people today. This ability of Shakespeare, the poet-playwright Magus, to leave no trace, as we say in Zen Buddhism, or as Rudolf Steiner said, to withdraw behind his characters, but at the same time, the undeniable testament of his genius with a capital G. Well, these two aspects of Shakespeare are for many people in our present age an annoying contradiction. Folks these days, and I do include myself, have grown up in a post-romantic world that accepts many romantic modern assumptions about artists and authorship. In this post-romantic world, we like to say that a person is a genius rather than saying, as they commonly did in Shakespeare's time and earlier, that a person has a genius. that is to say, that a person has a presiding genius or daemon. For example, Socrates spoke of his daemon, his inspiring or guiding spirit. This earlier notion of having a genius or daemon or a guiding spirit is a somewhat unfamiliar and off-putting notion today, although, of course, Philip Pullman and James Hillman have, for example, brought the term back into conversation. However, from our modern perspective, personality, personal history, biography is extremely important, and in truth it is. But from an older and less familiar spiritual perspective, personality is adventitious, and it gets in the way. Now, it's this older, more traditional idea of having a genius or daemon or a presiding spirit, rather than being a genius, that Blake refers to in his poem, and it's one reason I chose the poem for tonight's verse. You will find the same idea of genius implied in the title of A.C. Harwood's book on Shakespeare, I might add. All right, now, what did Rudolf Steiner have to say about Shakespeare? I will briefly summarize, and I'll refer you to this slim book from Steiner Books in case you want to do some reading. And I'll also refer you to the lectures on drama and speech that Rudolf Steiner gave right before his last address in 1924, when he stopped speaking and fell ill. I'll start with a lecture that Steiner gave at a workmen's school in Berlin in 1902. And by the way, Rudolf Steiner, to my knowledge, never provided any karmic biographical details about Shakespeare, as he did, for example, with Novalis. To begin with, then, Rudolf Steiner never claimed that someone else wrote Shakespeare's plays. On the contrary, Steiner insisted that it was self-evident that only the man Shakespeare, an actor, who was intimately involved with the nitty-gritty, gossipy, ambitiously human artistic business of a theater, could have written the plays. Rudolf Steiner also repeated an idea current in his time, and one which began to take hold really in the time of Novalis, that Shakespeare had a decisive impact on German literature, so much so that we might include Shakespeare as one of the German classics, right there along with Goethe and Schiller, although, as some have suggested, perhaps at an even higher level than either of them. Now, you can argue that among yourselves. But speaking as a student of German literature and English literature, you know I wear two hats, I agree that there's much to be said for this argument that Shakespeare did have a decisive impact on German literature. And Steiner even remarked in the drama course that he thought that some of the poetry by Shakespeare worked better in German than in English. And I've heard this before. The remark points to this uneasy creative tension between the Anglo-American English language realm and the Central European German language realm. Rudolf Steiner believed that it was wrong-headed to attempt to piece together Shakespeare's biography from the plays. And this is often done these days, by the way, as you probably know, by those who argue that Shakespeare was not Shakespeare, and by those who argue that he was. Both sides in the so-called authorship controversy want to convince us that Shakespeare's personality and biography can be extracted from the plays and plotted into something that reads like a novel. And it's a popular and appealing notion these days. But Rudolf Steiner said quite forthrightly that such readers have it wrong. He emphasized that Shakespeare's great talent resided in an ability to set aside his own personality when he wrote. Shakespeare became what he imagined and enacted, says Steiner, and I bolded the important sentences here. For Shakespeare, imagination and invention was the all and everything. And by the way, the poet Keats expressed a similar idea when he coined the famous phrase negative capability. Keats here spoke specifically about Shakespeare, and he saw negative capability as Shakespeare's distinguishing characteristic. And as another example, T.S. Eliot expressed a similar idea, in fact, when describing Henry James. Eliot said that James had a mind so fine that no idea could violate it. I mention Eliot tonight because I'll be talking about him soon when we get to the presentation that Jennifer Green and I have planned on the grammar of perception. That's coming up. So having said this, the next remark by Steiner might confuse you or at first seem to contradict what was said about personality and what Rudolf Steiner said about Shakespeare's ability to withdraw into his characters and leave no trace. Because Rudolf Steiner also recognized that Shakespeare introduced something radically new and important into the Western tradition of secular humanist literature, the tradition that is the heart matter of concern for our section. And here is a picture of Petrarch and Laura. As with the modern critic Harold Bloom, Steiner suggests that Shakespeare invents what human means to us as modern individuals in this age of the consciousness soul. That is to say, Shakespeare shows us how to act as modern psychologizing individuals. That's the thesis. With his plays, he provides a blueprint, so to speak. And here's the quote by Rudolf Steiner, and I'll read it. Shakespeare's plays are above all character dramas. During the early Middle Ages, we find, even in Dante, and in spite of Dante's strong personality, the basic expression of the Christian ideas of that time. The Christian type of his time, not the individual human personality, appeared in the foreground. This was the general conception. The Christian principle had no interest in individual personality. But little by little, a new worldview aroused interest in the individual human being. Only gradually did a new interest in the individual arise by means of the different viewpoint. In other words, Shakespeare demonstrates for us artistically an individualized secular humanist path to the spirit. And just as an aside, I sometimes find myself in conversation with persons who reflexively assume that the term secular humanist means that a person is a materialist or a hedonist or a godless anti-Christian who is oblivious, uninterested, or antagonistic to the spiritual world. But this is a quite recent and blinkered social political reading of the term secular humanist. The plays of Shakespeare are foundational for the secular humanist literary tradition that begins, as many have argued, at the time of Petrarch. And we need to be careful how we understand that term. Now, jumping ahead from 1902 to keep this brief, Rudolf Steiner emphasized in 1922 in Stratford that when we contemplate Shakespeare, we need to consider that more than a single human personality was at work. Indeed, says Steiner, the spirit of his century was at work, and with it the spirit of the whole of human evolution. Mighty words. Perhaps we'll have a favorable opportunity to research those words in future meetings, but tonight I can only point to them. So to wind things up now, Steiner remarked in 1920 that Shakespeare and Francis Bacon were inspired from the same spiritual source. And Steiner emphasized that Shakespeare lived at a significant time of transition in the development of the human being, between what Steiner calls the fourth and fifth post-Atlantean periods. The mood of this time of transition informs the drama Hamlet, Steiner says, and he has some very interesting and somewhat amusing asides about Hamlet and Professor Faust. Now, in more academic terms, we say that Shakespeare lived transitionally between the pre-modern and modern world outlooks, and that his plays dramatize this transitional tension. He was what we also call in the Academy a liminal personality, as we say, someone who shape-shifted freely across boundaries, like a shaman. And like a shaman, or initiate, as some of us prefer, he was impossible to pin down. I think anyone who's worked with Shakespeare's biography has that feeling somewhat, to a greater or lesser extent. And because he lived in this transitional time and felt fully attuned to it, Steiner tells us that Shakespeare channeled the continuous current that flows through human evolution from the ancient mysteries, from their cults and rites, wholly into his inner life. He took this impulse of the ancient mysteries, and his plays come forth like dreams that are awake and real. And in the drama course, by the way, Steiner says some very interesting things about acting and lucid dreaming. And this quote, by the way, about the ancient mysteries is a theme that you will find developed in two books that perhaps you've already read. One by Friedrich Hebel, translated actually by a former Fair Oakian, Barbara Betteridge, and another very interesting book that I enjoy by Margaret Bennell. Steiner notes that Shakespeare became a wealthy man, and indeed Shakespeare did. Moreover, he was the first author in history to achieve what we now call name-brand bestseller sales and recognition. But Rudolf Steiner is a bit off the mark when he says that Shakespeare was indifferent to the publication of his plays. Moreover, Steiner lived during a time when it was underappreciated that Shakespeare worked quite actively as a collaborator with other playwrights. Shakespeare apparently had no qualms about revising or cutting or changing his plays to suit the practical demands of a performance. Was Hamlet too long? Was that soliloquy too much? Okay, no problem. Cut it. On with the show. Playwriting was a business, and Shakespeare was a practical man of the theater, and theater, as we know, was the new thing. Theater was, as we say these days, a disruptor enterprise run by men who were supremely talented artists and who also had just discovered capitalism, as the English were doing at this time. And they were off and running, and it was a disruptive age. And regarding the quote I just displayed, Rudolf Steiner also made the statement that all the plays culminate in the age of Elizabeth, when, in fact, a very significant and lengthy part of Shakespeare's mature career occurred under King James, who was his patron. Think of Macbeth, King Lear, Antony and Cleopatra, Pericles, the Romances, The Tempest. Shakespeare amazingly never broke stride or crested and rested on his laurels. he went on to ever greater perfection of his art. Rudolf Steiner also underplays that Shakespeare wrote for two theaters. Steiner prefers to reference the Globe Theater, but Shakespeare was a well-paid part owner of one of the first indoor theaters, the Blackfriars, and it was very successful, as you probably know, and became in fact the model for our modern theaters, whereas the Globe as a theater model died away. So finally, to conclude and pass this over to Fred, I just want to point out an interesting fact relevant to our observance of the centennial years 1922, 1923, and 1924. The drama course concluded on September 23, 1924, just 5 days before the last address. And at the very conclusion of the drama course, at the end of the last lecture, Rudolf Steiner devoted attention to Shakespeare and to Hamlet, the play, and to the character Hamlet. Steiner acted out in German a scene from the play, the to be or not to be soliloquy. And 5 days later he gave his last address. And who does he recommend to our attention there? Novalis, Shakespeare and Novalis, two very important poet-writers. And as I've said in past meetings, Rudolf Steiner gave at the beginning of his teaching of anthroposophy what he called his first address, and that was a lecture on the poet Goethe. So in a certain sense, we have Goethe at the beginning, Shakespeare and Novalis at the end. Now, I hope we will have time to discuss this mystery and the connections between Goethe, Shakespeare, and Novalis a bit more in our future meetings. I just plant that as a seed. And now I turn the evening over to Fred. Fred, you'll have to unmute yourself, and I will stop the screen share until you tell me that you need it.
Okay. Now, whenever Bruce and I talked about doing a presentation on Shakespeare, the authorship controversy would be hanging around somewhere on the periphery of our conversation. But in a nutshell, the question is this: were the plays attributed to Shakespeare written by the person of that name, who was born in Stratford in 1564, died in Stratford in 1616, and had a career as an actor and a producer in the London theater for about 25 years, or were they written by somebody else? Now, there have been a lot of candidates over the years, including Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, but the leading contender by far is Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. People who support the man named Shakespeare from Stratford are called Stratfordians, and people who support Oxford as the real author are called Oxfordians. Now, the authorship controversy didn't exist for more than 200 years after Shakespeare's death. Nobody imagined that the author of the plays was anybody but the man from Stratford. So what happened? Well, as Bruce was mentioning, for one thing, since the middle of the 19th centuries, there's been this growing sense among literary people that works of fiction are deeply connected with the life of the author, that literature is, in some sense, autobiographical. So people began to look hard at what they knew about the life of this person named Shakespeare. Well, he came from the rural countryside. He never left England, and he had a very limited field of personal experience. But the plays have to do with kings and courts and aristocratic customs and manners, about war and wealth and the workings of the law. And they're mostly set in other places and other times. So where did he get the basic knowledge to write the plays? Who had at most a grammar school education. And the documents we know that he wrote consist of a very mundane will, an application for a coat of arms, and 3 lawsuits he had going to collect money from his neighbors. But the playwright that we know has a huge vocabulary, an absolutely unsurpassed intellect, an enormous scope of reference, and it seems at least a nobility of spirit. So how could an undereducated, middle-class moneylender, this tight-fisted showbiz guy from the sticks, be the man who wrote King Lear, The Tempest, and Hamlet? The answer for a great many people is he just couldn't. So what about De Vere, the Earl of Oxford? Well, De Vere was a nobleman. He was extremely well connected to the Elizabethan court. He was an adventurer. He'd been everywhere. And he spent a great deal of time in Italy, which is the setting of so many Shakespeare plays. He was a patron of the theater, even a part owner of one. And he had a pretty solid literary output of his own, mostly poetry. As a bonus, he was once on a sea voyage where he was captured by pirates, exactly like Hamlet. But the Earl of Oxford died in 1604. 1604. Dying in 1604 presents a bit of a challenge, since at least 11 of the plays attributed to Shakespeare were performed after 1605, after Oxford's death. That inconvenience does not deter the Oxfordians. After all, the Oxfordian theory is a conspiracy theory. Its whole point is that the Earl of Oxford didn't want anyone to know he wrote the plays, and he concealed the fact. So he must have enlisted someone, well, actually a whole number of someones from the theater company, to keep his cover that he had nothing to do with the plays and that they were all written by that actor from Stratford. Now, if you're comfortable with that kind of scenario, it isn't too much of a stretch to assume that the crafty Oxford had drafts of King Lear, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, and 6 or 7 other plays in the hopper and ready to be staged at discrete intervals by these very same conspirators after he died. Conspirators who had no reason anymore to keep the conspiracy. And another thing, there are contemporary events that happened after the death of Oxford that are clearly referenced in some of these later plays. So you have to assume that the conspirators kept updating Oxford's drafts. But it doesn't seem to matter. The controversy is alive and well. And there's a long, long list of people who've come out as anti-Stratfordians, or at least expressed very strong misgivings. Authors like Mark Twain, Sigmund Freud, Henry James, William James, Helen Keller, Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Shakespearean actors like Derek Jacobi and Mark Rylance. At least 3 former US Supreme Court justices and more. There are universities in the United States and in the UK that offer master's degrees in the subject of the authorship controversy. And very prominent communications media like the New York Times, the Atlantic, and NPR regularly promote the anti-Stratfordian position on at least an equal footing with a pro-Stratfordian position. So the idea that Shakespeare didn't write the plays, well, it's a minority position in academia for sure. It has a lot of distinguished adherents and very enthusiastic ones. So at this point, I think I better declare myself. I'm a Stratfordian. I'm not persuaded that the man named Shakespeare was incapable of writing the plays. I think genius has nothing to do with biography and almost everything to do with imagination. And as for Shakespeare's education, finishing grammar school then meant that he probably got a classical education better than most Americans get today.
Certainly better.
And from the limited experience I've had with the theater, I think being an actor would be a strong argument in favor of his authorship. There are references to the stage and to playing a role all through the plays. And the audience he had were not just noblemen. They're landlords, shopkeepers, drunks, pickpockets, and whores. So the playwright had to know them well enough to keep them interested, because once you lose a part of the audience during a performance, you're quickly going to lose them all. That's the theater. And from what experience I've had as a lawyer, I cannot imagine successfully arguing a case claiming that a secret cabal of nobles and theater people maintained a fraud on the people of London for 25 years without anyone catching on. They're just not bright enough. I do find the authorship controversy fascinating, not the question of which side to take, but the question of why there's a controversy at all. And I think the reason is this. There's near universal recognition of Shakespeare's genius. It's not only that he's better than everyone else, it's that he's better in kind, he's unique. Once you become immersed in Shakespeare, you find it hard to believe that anybody, let alone this guy from Stratford, could have written these plays. And so you instinctively reach out for some explanation, however extravagant it might be. But instead of thinking of authorship horizontally, in terms of biography, this dovetails with a lot of what Bruce was saying, maybe we should look at it vertically in terms of the imagination. We should recognize that the best art doesn't come from an author's worldly biography, but from his experience of a universal sphere, what we can call the spiritual, the divine, from what Keats called negative capability, the ability to identify with something beyond yourself without having to make it conform to your own preconceived thoughts. Shakespeare, just like Bruce said, is said to disappear into his characters, to let them say what they want to say. His ego just vanishes. And in its place, you have this magnificent generosity. The Argentinian writer, Jorge Luis Borges, one of my favorites, said in a famous essay that Shakespeare was both everyone and no one. And that may partly explain the obsession for knowing who Shakespeare really is. But whether their author is everyone or no one, his characters are so alive, so believable, so full of possibility, they always surprise you. As an actor, you can play them one year in a completely different way from how you played them 5 years ago. And both ways will be right. Each interpretation will be based on what's in the script, what's been given to us by Shakespeare. I think many of you probably know Peter Brook, the great English stage director. Peter Brook imagines Shakespeare walking through the streets of London, living each single moment with an incredible richness of awareness, so many levels, infinite levels of meaning. Bottomless, to borrow from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Each line of Shakespeare, Brook says, is an atom. The energy that can be released is infinite if we can split it open. So how do we split it open? Language. Language is Shakespeare's tool for creating all that energy, all that life. And it's the main tool an actor has for delivering it to an audience. Language that's completely different from anyone else's, packed with intensity, moving from one image to another one with lightning speed. It's the intellect being inundated by the spirit, the very act of thinking on display. Now, his characteristic language form, as we heard last week from Cliff Venho, is iambic pentameter, usually unrhymed, what we call blank verse. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. But this is his default verse. Only about 75% of Shakespeare's lines are even verse to begin with. The rest is prose. And the variation's important. Very generally, prose is undemonstrative when you play it. And when you say it next to verse, it brings everything down to earth. So reality breaks in on romance. Instead of ideals, instead of honor, the focus shifts to getting your next meal. And where he does use verse, the power is in his variations from the standard iambic line and how you stress those variations. We'll get into that a little more later. Now, actors who are having trouble with a character that they've been asked to play, they sometimes resort to developing what's called a backstory for the character, imagining what the character might have done or had done to her in events before the play began. Or if the character is going through a powerful experience of an emotion, anger, shame, infatuation, and the actor can't quite reach it, he may be advised to use sense memory, which is a vividly remembered experience in his own life that'll bring his character's experience alive on stage. That's method. But the advice I've heard given so often when an actor is having trouble with a character he's playing in a Shakespeare play, and it's really good advice, is just let the language carry you. And it works. Shakespeare's intelligence is vast, and he's already given you the solution to your problem in the script. The pauses and the stresses and the punctuation, they're all there for a purpose, to give direction to the actor, to help the actor bring the character alive. So just a couple of examples from a great director named John Barton. And Bruce, this is the time when I'd be using the screen share. Here's Henry V encouraging his men to go into battle with the odds completely stacked against them. Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more. 7 stresses instead of 5. It's sudden, it's urgent, it's single syllables, and you can't miss it. Or in The Winter's Tale, Leontes is the king who's being driven mad with jealousy because he thinks for no reason that his wife has betrayed him with his best friend. And just when his suspicions are congealing in him, he's alone for a minute with his 7-year-old son telling him to go play while his mother is playing, he thinks, with his best friend. He says, "Go play, boy, play. Thy mother plays and I play too, but so disgraced a part whose issue will hiss me to my grave." So how do you act the second line, the line that begins play two? One way is to have Leontes deliberately declaiming a triple play on words: child's play, the play of sexual dalliance, and playing a part in a play. He's feeling it all and he's saying it. You make the second line a run-on of the first, like this. Go play, boy, play. Thy mother plays and I play too, but so disgraced a part whose issue will hiss me to my grave. But you have a choice. You can have Leontes hesitate for a fraction of a second, not knowing what exactly he's going to say, or maybe intending to say something different. But then he's prompted by his own words in the previous line and by his own suspicions just breathing beneath the surface. And a third meaning of play suddenly jumps into his mind in the moment, like this. Go play, boy, play. Thy mother plays and I play too, but so disgraced a part whose issue will hiss me to my grave. A single iambic line can do so much. Now, here's the king proposing to his accomplice Hubert, murdering the boy Arthur. He's being very careful of what he says, but he convinces Hubert. There's 5 speakers, there's 5 thoughts, and it all happens in one line. Death, my lord, a grave, he shall not live, enough. There's something else that language does in Shakespeare, something more profound, but to talk about it, I have to say something first about form and unity in the plays generally, and particularly in Hamlet. Peter Brook speaks about something he calls the inner play, or the secret play, that exists inside each one of the great plays of Shakespeare. It will be reflected in some vibrant way of using words, maybe a whole pattern of language that keeps the clarity, but at the same time suggests something way beyond it. It can't be named or analyzed, but it can be experienced. It's there inside all the conventions, the story, the suspense, the humor, and it can't be there without them. But it works like a spell if you're open to it, like a charm, like magic. It's an experience of the spiritual world. Owen Barfield talks about it in his essay, The Form of Hamlet. He says that when we try to give a name to the form or the unity of Hamlet, we always tend to come up with notions like uncertainty or mutual distrust. It's all very interesting when we're working it out, but then we actually go see the play again, and the theory is just hopelessly thin and inadequate. It crumbles to dust. That's because we've left the single most essential thing out of it, the life. What we've been trying to get at can only begin to be understood not as an idea, but as a spiritual being, something that encompasses much, much more than just uncertainty or distrust, but not as a principle, as a living being. And we have to try to conceive of this being as present in its full power just below the crust of Shakespeare's waking consciousness and already beginning to break through. We have to think of Shakespeare's imagination as secretly pregnant with the whole age that was dawning then in humanity, as Steiner said, and what Cliff last week referred to as the transition from the intellectual soul to the consciousness soul. A totally self-conscious ego is being detached for the first time from the spiritual world that rules in his unconscious. And so Hamlet is acutely aware of an infinitude of meaning in the spiritual world, but at the same time, he feels himself completely cut off from it. So there's an agonizing sense of always being in between infinitude and the void, truth and doubt, the unconscious and the conscious, the intellectual soul and the conscious and the soul, to be and not to be. The words of the play all point to this being in between, but they can't change it. We have the most magnificent words in the English language, but they can't save the characters that speak them. Words, words, words. It's the paralysis of the consciousness soul, the soul that has to make up its mind to act on its own unsupported initiative. But it doesn't feel anymore these old instinctive promptings of the spirit. It's the language that conjures the living being, that opens into the secret play. Look for the antitheses. Words set against words. They're all over the place in Shakespeare, but particularly in Hamlet. It's not too much to say that the whole play, or at the very least, the first three acts of it, turns on antithesis. So, to be or not to be, that is the question. Now, that's as antithetical a thought as you can have, but the next lines use antithesis too. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. That's the pattern in the shape of all the soliloquies. For Hamlet, everything he says cancels itself out. He's always in between. And the rest of the language of the first three acts, outside the soliloquies, is just teeming with these doubled words. The gross in scope of my opinion, the shot and danger of desire, a little more than kin and less than kind. It's the paralysis of words. And if antithesis is the portrait of Hamlet, the loquacity of Polonius is its carnival house mirror. Hamlet's a very long play, and one of the scenes that's usually cut is Act 2, Scene 1, where Polonius is instructing his servant Rinaldo in how to spy on his son Laertes. The reason it tends to be cut is that they see it purely as comic relief and not really related to the rest of the play. But think of the most famous speech of the play, To Be or Not to Be, and how the words and phrases run up against and undercut each other and lead to no solution. Then listen to Polonius becoming swaddled in his own fatuous sentences, qualifying everything and ultimately saying nothing. So I'm going to do that part, but first I'm going to try to speak Polonius's lines in an upper class English accent and the few lines of his servant Rinaldo in Cockney to distinguish them. And then the word danskers means Danes, just so you know that. And finally, drabbing means associating with prostitutes. So, inquire me first what danskers are in Paris, and how and who, what means and where they keep, what company, at what expense, and finding by this encompassment and drift of question that they do know my son, come you more nearer than your particular demands will touch it. Take you as 'twere some distant knowledge of him. It's thus, I know his father and his friends, and in part him. Do you mark this, Rinaldo? Aye, very well, my lord. And in part him, but you may say not well. And if it be he, I mean he's very wild, addicted so-and-so, and there put on him what forgeries you please. Marry none so rank as may dishonor him, take heed of that. But such wanton, wild, and usual slips as are companions noted and most known to youth and liberty. As gaming, my lord? Aye, or drinking, fencing, swearing, quarreling, drabbing, you may go so far. My lord, that would dishonor him. Faith, as you may season it in the charge, you must not put another scandal on him that he's open to incontinency. That's not my meaning. breathe his thoughts so quaintly that they may seem the taints of liberty, the flash and outbreak of a fiery mind, a savageness in unreclaimed blood of general assault. Marry, sir, here's my drift, and I believe it is a fetch of wit. You laying these slight sallies on my son, as 'twere a thing a little soiled with working, mark you, your party in converse, him you would sound, having ever seen in the predominant crimes the youth you breathe of guilty, be assured he closes with you in this consequence. Good sir, or sir, or friend, or gentleman, according to the phrase or the addition of man and country. Very good, my lord. And then, sir, does he this? It does. What was I about to say? By the mass, I was about to say something. Where did I leave? Closes in the consequence. It closes in the consequence? Aye, marry, it closes thus. I know the gentleman. I saw him yesterday, or the other day, or then, with such or such. And as you say, there was a gaming, there all tookens rouse, there falling out at tennis, or perchance I saw him enter such a house of sale, vide licit, a brothel, or so forth. See you now your bait of falsehood take this carp of truth. And thus do we of wisdom and of reach, with windlasses and with assays of bias, by indirections find direction out. So, by my former lecture and advice, shall you, my son, you have me, have you not? So Polonius here is completely a part of the world of the first three acts, in between his own thoughts, arriving nowhere. The soul floats suspended, uncertain of its own identity. And we're taken back to the very first words of the play. Who's there?
Who's there?
Nay! Answer me! Stand and unfold yourself!
Long live the king!
Bernardo,
He!
you come most carefully upon your hour.
'Tis now struck 12. Get thee to bed, Francisco.
For this relief, much thanks. 'Tis bitter cold, and I am sick at heart.
No, we got it.